The air in the Appalachian Mountains of West Virginia, 1901, was thick, not just with the damp chill of an early September morning, but with a stifling, unspoken fear. The small, isolated community of Black Creek was a collection of rough-hewn cabins and modest clapboard houses nestled deep in a holler, a deep valley where the shadows lingered long after sunrise. Life here was already a constant, arduous negotiation with the unforgiving earth. But the murder of Elias Vance, the community's only pharmacist, 3 weeks ago, had splintered the fragile peace. Elias had been found in his home, a bullet wound clean through his chest. No signs of forced entry, nothing stolen, no witnesses save perhaps the restless mountain wind. The local sheriff, a stoic, overwhelmed man named Thomas "Tom" Barlow, had declared it a robbery gone wrong, but the explanation felt thin, like stretched muslin over a gaping wound. Elias had been a quiet man, respected, if somewhat reserved. The official explanation was for the benefit of the outside world, a narrative to prevent panic. But in the close-knit silence of Black Creek, everyone knew the truth was darker, residing in the crevices of their own distrust. 6-year-old Nora lived with her parents, Martha and Joseph, in a cabin perched near the ridge, close enough to see the smoke from the town's chimneys, but far enough to feel the chilling isolation. Nora was not like the other children. Her world was intensely internal, filtered through a pair of large, preternaturally observant eyes that seemed to absorb the nuances of adult anxiety. While the other children played games of pursuit and hide-and-seek, Nora would sit silently on the porch swing, watching the faces of the people who passed on the muddy, rutted track below. Her mother, Martha, a woman whose hands were permanently calloused from farm work, often worried. "Nora, why don't you go down and play with little Billy or Clara?" she'd ask, her voice strained. Nora would look up, her gaze clear and unsettlingly direct. "They are hiding their fear in their games, Mama." "It's too loud." Martha would shudder, pulling her shawl tighter, her gaze drifting toward the dense forest that encircled the holler like a hungry beast. The murder had done more than just take a life. It had amplified the deep-seated paranoia inherent in a place where self-reliance was the only law. Every neighbor now looked at every other neighbor with a cold, searching suspicion. The weather mirrored the community's emotional state. A low, slate-gray sky had hung over Black Creek for days, occasionally spitting a miserable drizzle that turned the main track into slick mud. The air smelled of wet earth, wood smoke, and a faint metallic tang that Nora, with her heightened senses, associated with the lingering presence of violence. One afternoon, Sheriff Barlow rode up the ridge, his horse blowing heavy, visible steam into the cold air. The sight of him, a symbol of authority that had proven utterly impotent against the killer, only increased Martha's tension. "Afternoon, Martha, Joseph," Barlow greeted, removing his worn hat. He looked exhausted, his face gaunt. "Just following up on a few things, see if anyone noticed any strangers passing through 3 weeks ago." Joseph, a logger whose broad shoulders carried the literal weight of his work, wiped his hands on his denim trousers. "Tom, we've told you 50 times. No one. This is Black Creek. You see a stranger, you know it. It was someone from here." His voice was heavy with conviction and accusation. Barlow sighed, rubbing his temple. "Joseph, without a weapon, without a clear motive, and without a single person willing to swear they heard a shot or saw a flicker of movement, I have nothing but rumor and guesswork. I'm waiting on the state police, but they treat us like a forgotten appendix down here." Nora, still on the swing, stopped its gentle rhythm. She fixed her eyes on the sheriff's leather saddlebag. She didn't speak, but her stillness pulled his attention. "Hello there, Nora," Barlow said, trying for a friendly smile that didn't quite reach his weary eyes. "Still the quietest girl in the county, huh?" Nora slowly slid off the swing. She walked up to the sheriff and pointed, not at him, but at a specific spot on the mud-splattered leather of his saddlebag, near the buckle. "The mud is different there, Sheriff," she whispered, her voice surprisingly clear. "It is sticky wet, like from the swamp. not the slick wet from the road. Barlow looked down, puzzled. He ran a gloved finger over the spot. It was a darker, thicker, more cohesive clump of mud than the splatters surrounding it. The swamp, the stagnant, heavily wooded area near the old abandoned mine, was several miles away, off the main road. Why would his bag have swamp mud? He hadn't been near the swamp in days. Joseph frowned. "Nora, go inside. Don't bother the sheriff." But Barlow held up a hand, a flicker of something new, a reluctant, desperate curiosity in his eyes. "No, wait. You went down to the swamp today, Tom?" Barlow shook his head. "Not in a week, and my bag hasn't left the office since then." He examined the mud clump again, his brow furrowed. That is odd." He tried to dismiss it with a shrug. "Must have picked it up somewhere." Nora interrupted, her voice gaining an unexpected intensity. She wasn't looking at the mud anymore. She was looking past the sheriff, toward the dense, oppressive line of trees. "The mud is from where he hid the other thing, Sheriff. The other thing that smells of wet metal and sad, broken things. He forgot to clean his bag." The statement hung in the cold air, sharp and utterly nonsensical to the adults, yet carrying a chilling weight. The other thing. Wet metal. Sad, broken things. The hair stood up on Martha's arms. Barlow's face went pale. He had told no one that Elias Vance had been found with his grandfather's war medal, a heavy brass object, clutched so tightly it had dug into his palm. It was the only unusual non-stolen item. The police surgeon had to pry it out. "Nora," Barlow said, his voice dropping to a near whisper. "What are you talking about, child?" Nora merely met his gaze, the quiet intensity in her eyes like a beacon in the general gloom. "The echo in the hollers, Sheriff. It's not just the wind. It's the sound of lies settling in the earth." She pointed again, this time to the south, the direction of the swamp and the abandoned mine. "Go look where the ground is loose near the big broken willow. That's where the sad broken thing is now." Barlow exchanged a look with Joseph, a look of mutual, profound unease. Was this a disturbed child, a dreamer, or was she articulating a truth they were too afraid to voice? The mud on the bag was a fact. The medal was a secret. The fear gripping the community was real. As the sheriff mounted his horse, the atmosphere shifted. The psychological terror had found an unnerving small voice. Nora, a 6-year-old, had, in a single cryptic observation, introduced a variable into the investigation that science, the rudimentary forensics of the time, could not explain, focusing the spotlight of suspicion not on an outsider, but on the hidden secrets of Black Creek itself. Before you go, make sure to subscribe to the channel and hit the notification bell. Your support helps us dive deeper into these dark, untold mysteries. Let us know in the comments what you think Nora truly saw. Sheriff Tom Barlow rode away from the ridge with the peculiar sensation of having been struck by lightning. The conversation with little Nora had been brief, unsettling, and yet it was the first piece of concrete, feelable information he'd gotten in 3 agonizing weeks. The mud on his saddlebag, the swamp, the sad, broken thing. He dismissed the last part as a child's fanciful language, but the swamp mud, that was a variable. He reined in his horse at the edge of the holler, where the main track forked. One path leading to the town center, the other, seldom used, snaking down towards the Black Creek swamp and the abandoned Blackwood mine. That mine had been closed since the great shaft collapse of '94, and now the area was a damp, forbidding thicket of waterlogged timber and stagnant pools. No sensible person went there. Barlow dismounted, his boots sinking slightly into the wet earth. He took the saddlebag off his horse, inspecting the mud clump with a sudden intensity. It was indeed different. Darker, almost black, with fine, almost silty particles, characteristic of the swamp's dense, organic soil, unlike the iron-red clay common on the higher ridges. He had lent the bag to his deputy Silas 2 days ago for a routine trip to the neighboring county seat. Silas had reported no detours. The cold, logical mind of the lawman fought a fierce battle with the primal fear instilled by Nora's unnerving certainty. The mud is from where he hid the other thing. The sound of lies settling in the earth. He shook his head, pushing the eerie poetry aside. The only way to silence the child's echo in his mind was to confront the swamp itself. He took the path toward the Blackwood mine. The descent was steep, the trail choked with rhododendrons and thick underbrush. The light was failing fast, turning the forest into a confusing mosaic of grays and deep shadows. The atmosphere here was heavier, damp and silent, broken only by the crunch of his boots and the distant, lonely call of a jay. Every fallen log, every shift in the tangled briars looked like a hiding place. The fear was not of a ghost, but of the very real, very human killer who had, according to Nora, left a trace here. He reached the swamp floor. The air was colder, smelling strongly of decay and marsh gas. He scanned the edges, looking for the big, broken willow. After 20 minutes of fruitless searching, frustration, compounded by the rising tide of fear, threatened to turn him back. He was a sensible man. He shouldn't be hunting for a sad, broken thing based on the babbling of a strange child. Then he saw it. A massive willow, struck by a past storm, lay half submerged in a shallow pool, its exposed roots looking like the gnarled claws of some subterranean monster. Near its base, where the bank sloped steeply into the stagnant water, the ground was disturbed. Freshly turned earth, dark and clumpy, visible despite the faint light. Someone had dug here recently and tried, poorly, to conceal their work by kicking loose leaves and pine needles over it. Barlow's heart hammered a heavy, irregular rhythm against his ribs. He pulled a small folding shovel from his coat pocket, his hands trembling slightly, and began to dig. The earth was surprisingly yielding. The tension in his shoulders was excruciating, every nerve on edge, expecting a masked man to leap out of the shadows. But there was only silence, the persistent hum of insects, and the sound of the shovel biting into the wet soil. After only a few minutes, the shovel struck something hard. Not a rock. Metallic, with a hollow, distinct clank. Barlow knelt, scraping the last of the dirt away with his bare hands. It was a box. A standard cast-iron cash box, heavily waterlogged, but clearly locked. Barlow leaned back on his heels, breathing hard, a cold sweat breaking out on his forehead despite the chill. The box was not what Nora had described. No sad, broken thing. But it confirmed her uncanny accuracy regarding the location and the disturbed earth. Someone had hidden something of value here, and that someone had recently used the sheriff's own saddlebag, suggesting a deputy or someone with access to the sheriff's office. He hauled the heavy box out of the ground. He didn't have the keys, and the lock was thick. He decided to take it back to his office, where he could force it open. As he turned, he realized the darkness was complete. He had to use the small lantern he carried. On his slow, careful ride back up to the main track, he wrestled with the implications. The box must have belonged to Elias Vance. What was inside? Evidence? And if so, why was a deputy involved in its concealment? Silas? It seemed unthinkable. Silas was a pillar of the community, a family man. But Nora's observation had been irrefutable. The mud did not lie. Back in his small, dusty office, a converted general store annex, Barlow wedged the box open with a crowbar. The metal shrieked under the pressure, the sound echoing unnervingly in the empty room. Inside, the contents were water-damaged, but recognizable. Not money, not jewels. Instead, there was a stack of ledgers and a handful of sealed envelopes tied with twine. Barlow pulled out the ledgers. They were Elias Vance's business records, meticulously kept. But the entries were not for pharmaceutical sales. They were detailed records of monetary loans, interest rates, and overdue payments. Vance, the quiet pharmacist, had been Black Creek's secret moneylender. He flipped through the names, his finger tracing the meticulous handwriting. Almost every single family in the holler was listed. The farmers, the loggers, the local store owner, all deeply in debt to Elias Vance. And right at the top of the list, with the largest, most dangerously overdue balance, Silas Croft. The name hit Barlow like a physical blow. Silas, his deputy. Silas, who had borrowed the saddlebag. Silas, who had access to the swamp road, the office, and the inside knowledge of the investigation. The suspicion, cold and precise, settled in his gut. Barlow opened the envelopes. They contained promissory notes and letters, desperate, pleading letters detailing the crippling poverty and the impossible interest rates Vance had imposed. One letter, signed simply SCE, threatened Vance with violence if he didn't lower the debt. The language was venomous, the handwriting shaky with fear and rage. The pieces clicked into place with horrifying clarity. Silas was desperate, drowning in debt to Vance, who likely threatened to expose him. Silas had the opportunity, the means, a gun easy to acquire, and now the motive, financial ruin and public shame. The murder wasn't a robbery gone wrong, it was a debt settled with a bullet. But where did Nora fit in? The mud explained Silas's route, the box provided the motive. But Nora's words, the sad, broken thing, the wet metal, still haunted him. Vance's military medal, the only piece of metal found, was in his evidence bag, currently locked in the safe. Barlow walked to the safe, his movements slow and deliberate. He pulled out the evidence bag and untied the drawstring. The heavy brass medal gleamed faintly in the lamplight. It was cold to the touch. As he held the medal, examining the slight tarnishing from the blood and dampness, he realized something horrific. The box had contained the motive. The medal was the truth. And Nora, with her 6-year-old wisdom, had seen a connection he, a seasoned lawman, had completely missed. The sad, broken thing was not the box. It was this. But why would she connect this to the swamp? And why did Silas take the risk of hiding the evidence of the motive, the ledgers, but leave the primary evidence, the gun and the murder weapon, hidden perhaps somewhere else? A noise from outside, a soft, almost imperceptible scrape of leather on the wooden porch, jolted Barlow. He froze, the metal clutched in his hand. The lamp cast long, nervous shadows. The door to the office, which he had left slightly ajar, was now slowly, silently, being pushed open. Barlow spun around, pulling the heavy service revolver from his holster, the metallic click deafening in the silence. The sliver of opening widened. A figure stood silhouetted against the weak moonlight. "Tom," a voice whispered, familiar and strained. "What are you doing up at this hour?" It was Deputy Silas Croft, his face pale and etched with worry, holding a lantern whose light barely pierced the gloom. He looked genuinely surprised, but his eyes darted immediately to the cast-iron box on the table and the heavy brass medal glinting in Barlow's hand. Barlow slowly lowered his gun, the terror momentarily replaced by a chilling clarity of purpose. The real mystery wasn't the murder itself, but how to catch a killer who was already inside the gate. The tension in the sheriff's cramped office was a palpable, suffocating force. The single lamp cast their shadows as nervous, looming giants on the walls, emphasizing the profound isolation of Black Creek. Sheriff Tom Barlow stood opposite his deputy, Silas Croft. The evidence, the waterlogged cash box and Elias Vance's lone ledgers, resting between them on the scarred wooden table. "Silas," Barlow began, his voice low, measured, and dangerously calm. "I didn't expect you back tonight." Silas shuffled his feet, avoiding eye contact. He was a powerfully built man, his face usually open and trustworthy, but now his features were tight, drawn, and coated in a thin veneer of fear. "I couldn't sleep, Tom. Been thinking about the Vance case. It's eating at me. Thought I'd check the reports, maybe see something we missed." His eyes, however, kept returning to the box. "You missed something, all right," Barlow stated, his hand resting near the butt of his revolver. "You missed this." He tapped the cash box. "And you missed cleaning the swamp mud off my saddlebag when you borrowed it." Silas froze. The color drained from his face, leaving a sickly gray. His attempt at innocent surprise failed spectacularly. "Swamp mud? I don't know what you mean, Tom. I went straight to the county seat and back. I didn't go near the Blackwood." "No." Barlow pushed one of Vance's open ledgers towards Silas. "This box was buried near the broken willow, Silas. And these records show you owe Elias Vance $2,000 overdue. And this," he gestured to the pleading, threatening letter signed S.C., "proves you were desperate enough to do almost anything to keep him quiet." Silas stared at the ledger, his composure finally breaking. He slumped into the chair, covering his face with his hands. His breathing was ragged, heavy. "Dear God, Tom, dear God." Barlow waited, letting the guilt and the fear ferment. He felt no triumph, only a deep, wrenching sadness. He and Silas had been friends since childhood, trusted colleagues for 10 years. This wasn't a villain. It was a man cornered by his own mistakes and a relentless lender. "Silas, tell me what happened," Barlow demanded gently. "Just tell me the truth. Did you kill Elias?" Silas lifted his head, his eyes red and brimming, but his denial was swift and fierce. "No. I swear to you, Tom, I didn't kill him. I went to see him, yes, 3 weeks ago, 2 nights before he was found. I went to beg him for an extension, for God's sake. He laughed at me, said he'd tell everyone, take my house, everything. Where did you go on the night of the murder, Silas?" "I was home, with Mary. You know I was. She can vouch for me." "And if she's protecting you?" Barlow countered, his voice sharp. "Silas, the ledgers were buried by the swamp." "Why?" Silas took a shuddering breath. "I found the box, Tom, the day after he was murdered. I was out near the holler checking trap lines. I saw the disturbed earth. I was terrified. Vance had been hounding me. I thought someone else had killed him over a debt, and I knew if these records got out, I'd be the first suspect. I dug it up, took it home, and read the letters. It proved everyone was suffering, and I thought if I hid them, it might save my own skin, make it look like a real robbery. It was panic, Tom, plain panic. I hid them again, later, by the willow. I did it 2 days ago when I borrowed the bag to go to the county seat. I only went a little out of my way. The explanation, while criminal in its obstruction of justice, carried the terrible ring of truth. A man, terrified and self-preserving, burying evidence that implicated him, even if he wasn't the killer. It was a failure of character, not necessarily a confession of murder." Barlow pointed to the brass medal on the table. "Then explain this, Silas. Explain what a 6-year-old girl told me." Silas looked confused, then horrified, as Barlow recounted Nora's words. "The mud is from where he hid the other thing that smells of wet metal and sad, broken things." "She said that," Silas stammered. "Nora, that strange little girl." He shook his head violently. "I don't know anything about that medal, Tom, I swear. When I found the box, it was just the ledgers and the notes, nothing else. What is it? Elias's war medal?" "It was found clutched in his hand," Barlow confirmed. "The only non-stolen item. Now listen to me, Silas. Nora didn't talk about the box. She talked about the wet metal and the sad, broken thing. She accurately predicted where you were going to hide the evidence of the motive. Why would she describe the metal and yet point you to the swamp?" A chilling third possibility began to take shape in Barlow's mind, a narrative more terrifying than a simple debt murder. Nora's sight, her preternatural observations, seemed to link Silas's act of hiding the motive, the ledgers, to the truth, the medal, as if the two were inseparable parts of the same moral decay gripping the holler. "If you didn't kill him, Silas," Barlow pressed, his eyes boring into his friend's, "then someone else did. Someone who knew about the debt, someone who knew you'd be the prime suspect, and someone who knew Vance kept records. Someone who, perhaps, wanted you to take the fall." Silas paled further, the implication terrifyingly clear. He was still guilty of obstructing justice, but he might also be the perfect unwitting scapegoat for a far colder, more calculating killer. But who, Tom? Who else knew about the debt? "Everyone in that ledger knew, Silas," Barlow said grimly, tapping the book. "And everyone in that ledger had a motive. Vance was bleeding this community dry. You just happened to be the one who panicked and drew suspicion to yourself." Barlow stood up, pacing the small office. I have to lock you up, Silas, for obstruction, but more importantly for your own safety and to buy me time. The killer is still out there, and they've already framed you perfectly. I need to find out why Nora linked that metal to the swamp." He looked at the metal again. It was brass, but Nora had said wet metal. The ledgers were waterlogged, sad, broken things. "The broken willow," Barlow muttered, replaying the scene. He looked at Silas, a sudden thought striking him. "When you buried the box, did you see anything else nearby? Anything at all?" Silas shook his head frantically. "No, just the willow and the mud." Barlow's gaze dropped to the metal again, its surface now reflecting the frantic lamplight. Nora's words were a riddle, a clue outside the realm of common sense. The child was not predicting, she was observing an emotional connection, a psychological chain of events. He secured Silas in the small, adjacent holding cell, the metallic slam of the door echoing the finality of the situation. Barlow then sat down and pulled out the rest of the sealed envelopes from the cash box. These envelopes did not contain promissory notes. They contained photographs, small, slightly faded album and prints, photos of various Black Creek residents, men mostly, entering and leaving a specific dilapidated cabin on the edge of town, a cabin known to be a rendezvous point for illicit activities. Blackmail. Vance wasn't just a moneylender, he was a blackmailer, using the secrets of the community as collateral. Barlow recognized the faces. The town elder, the minister, the owner of the general store. All of them on the loan ledger. All of them now with an airtight, private, and deeply damning motive for murder. Elias Vance was not killed for $2,000. He was killed for silence, for the survival of reputations. The terror in Black Creek was about to spread, no longer confined to debt, but to the darker, more shameful secrets that could destroy entire families. Barlow finally understood. Nora's observation was not about a single killer, but about the systemic moral rot that permeated the whole community. The sad, broken things were not the objects, but the lives Elias Vance had ruined. Sheriff Barlow spent the rest of the night hunched over the damning photographs and the ledger, the glow of the kerosene lamp his only company. The silence of the office, broken only by the occasional restless stirring from Silas in the adjacent cell, was heavy with the weight of the town's secrets. Black Creek was not just a community of hard-working folk. It was a viper's nest of desperation and shame. The photographs were irrefutable, grainy, but clear enough to identify the key figures of the holler engaging in acts of moral or civil transgression. Men of God caught gambling, town leaders consorting with disreputable women, even a clear image of a local councilman taking a bribe from a representative of the growing coal companies. These were the sad, broken things, the shattered reputations, the moral compromises that Vance had expertly catalogued and used for profit. Barlow cross-referenced the photographic subjects with the loan ledger. The connection was absolute. Every person captured in an incriminating photo also had a massive, overdue loan from Vance. The debt was the chain, and the secrets were the lock. Vance ensured compliance not with the courts, but with the threat of public ruin. The list of suspects had exploded from one desperate man, Silas, to almost the entire leadership of Black Creek. The murder was not an impulsive act of rage, but a coordinated, calculated strike for self-preservation. Barlow knew he couldn't simply ride out and arrest every man in those photos. That would incite the very panic Vance had sought to leverage, leading to chaos, violence, and, likely, a full-scale cover-up aided by those who valued their reputations above justice. He had to be strategic, finding the killer who initiated the act, the one who fired the bullet. He went to the cell door, peering through the small barred window at Silas, who was slumped on the cot, his head in his hands. "Silas," Barlow whispered, "I found more. Vance was blackmailing half the town. These pictures prove it." Silas lifted his head, a look of shocked horror on his face. Blackmail. Oh God, I knew he was cruel, but not this. Who? Barlow held up a photograph. It was a clear shot of Reverend Elias Kincaid, the man who delivered the Sunday sermons, slipping out of the back of the dilapidated cabin, his face tight with furtive fear. Silas's jaw dropped. Kincaid. But he preaches against sin every week. His wife. The community. Exactly, Barlow said grimly. And Kincaid is listed in the ledger for $3,000. Kincaid and 5 other men of influence. Any one of them could have killed Vance for the ledger. The real question is, which one of them coordinated the murder and the cover-up? Barlow realized the murderer was likely the one who ensured the crime looked like a random robbery, diverting suspicion from the ledger and the photographs. But the killer had made a crucial error, leaving the medal behind. The other thing that smells of wet metal and sad, broken things. Barlow's mind returned to Nora. The child's observational skills were now the only thing connecting the scattered pieces of the puzzle. He needed to talk to her again, not to ask about clues, but to ask about feelings, connections, the emotional truth that science and evidence ignored. Before dawn, Barlow rode to Nora's cabin, the air crisp and cold. He found Nora sitting on the porch, waiting, as if she had expected him. "Good morning, Sheriff," she greeted him calmly, not with a child's cheerful salutation, but with the sober gravity of an adult. "Good morning, Nora," Barlow said, dismounting. "I need your help again. I found the box, just like you said. It contained the reasons why Vance was killed. Secrets." Nora nodded slowly. "The air is cleaner now, Sheriff. The lies have been pulled out of the earth. But Nora, there's still a piece I don't understand," Barlow said, pulling out the brass medal. "This was found in Vance's hand. You called it the wet metal and the sad, broken thing. The mud on my bag came from the swamp, where the box was buried. Why did you link this medal, which was in Vance's house, to the place where the ledgers were hidden?" Nora did not look at the medal. She looked at Barlow, her wide eyes focused entirely on his face as if reading the truth there. "It is not about the medal, Sheriff," she explained, her voice a low murmur. "It is about the feeling. The man who came to your office, the man who buried the records." "Silas," Barlow confirmed. "Yes. When he touched the mud on your bag, he felt the same sick, fast feeling he had when he first saw this." Nora pointed not to the medal, but to Barlow's own wedding ring, a simple gold band. He saw the man who killed Vance look at this type of thing and get the sick, fast feeling. Barlow frowned, completely lost. Silas saw the killer look at a wedding ring. Why a wedding ring? Because the killer left one behind. Nora stated plainly, looking towards the south again, where the holler descended toward the valley floor and the small central church. The killer thought he needed to take the metal from his own hand to hold the sad, broken thing. He forgot. He looked back and saw he left a different metal, a thin, cold gold circle. He was angry. That metal proves he is married. That metal smells of his own fear. Barlow stared at her, the implication dawning with sickening clarity. The killer, in the moment of extreme panic following the gunshot, had reached into the dead man's hand to take the only thing Vance was grasping, the medal, believing it to be the evidence he needed, the reason for the murder. But in doing so, the killer had left a piece of his own life behind. The killer hadn't taken the wedding ring off before the murder. During the struggle or the subsequent hasty effort to remove the medal from Vance's tight grip, the killer's ring had slipped off his finger and was now lost somewhere near Vance's body. The killer had realized his mistake after the fact, and the realization had been one of the sad, broken things Nora had perceived. Barlow's mind raced. Kincaid, the Reverend, was the most deeply compromised, the most likely to coordinate a clean kill for a complete cover-up. He was a meticulous man, used to preparing sermons and managing appearances. A man who would notice a missing detail. Barlow showed Nora the photograph of Reverend Kincaid, a grim, self-righteous man in the picture. "Nora, look at this face. Does this man feel the sick, fast feeling you mentioned?" Nora looked at the photo, her eyes narrowing. "He is not feeling sick, Sheriff. He is feeling cold, like a stone that hides the heat of the fire. And he is missing a part of his hand." Barlow's breath hitched. He knew Kincaid always wore a ring. He was fiercely proud of his marriage. The next step was not to search the swamp, but to search the murder scene one more time, not for a gun, but for a simple, thin gold band. The only thing that could definitively tie the shame of the secrets to the hand that pulled the trigger was a wedding ring. Barlow thanked Nora, his mind reeling from the child's uncanny insight into psychological truth. He rode toward the center of Black Creek, the sun finally rising, casting a deceptive light over a town full of moral shadows. He had to act quickly before the town's leaders realized he had found the blackmail evidence. The true terror was just beginning. The Vance residence stood a little apart from the main cluster of homes, a sturdy two-story structure that now seemed to brood under the morning sun. The place had been sealed for 3 weeks, and the stillness of the house felt like a heavy shroud. Sheriff Barlow approached the back door, the very point of entry the killer must have used, and broke the simple wax seal. Inside, the silence was total. The air was stale and heavy with the smell of old dust and something metallic, the faint, lingering scent of a spent bullet casing. The murder had occurred in the small, cluttered study where Vance conducted his affairs. Barlow had processed the scene meticulously 3 weeks ago, searching for the weapon, for shell casings, for footprints, the standard physical evidence. He had found nothing conclusive. Now he was searching for an emotional mistake, the tiny, almost invisible consequence of a murderer's panic, guided only by the words of a child. The study was a dark room. Books lined the walls, and a large oak desk dominated the space, its surface still bearing the faint bloodstain where Vance had fallen. Barlow's initial search had focused on the floor, the entry points, the windows. Now he focused on the immediate vicinity of Vance's body, specifically the area where the body and the desperate clutching hand had rested. The first search, focused on a robbery, had been a failure. The second, focused on blackmail, had revealed the motive. This third, guided by the psychological truth of the crime, might reveal the killer. Barlow knelt beside the desk, directly where Vance's armchair had been overturned. He began to search methodically, centimeter by agonizing centimeter. The wooden floorboards were old and creaky, with narrow gaps between them. Dust, lint, and scraps of paper littered the area. He used his pocket knife to carefully scrape the dirt from the gaps, his eyes straining in the dim light. Minutes stretched into an hour. Frustration, cold and familiar, began to creep back in. Had Nora's perception been wrong? Was the wedding ring a metaphor, a symbolic representation of the marriage and life the killer was desperately trying to save? The rational part of him screamed that he was wasting time, that a gold band in the dust of a floor was a chimera. Just as he was about to give up, his gaze fell on a tiny, almost imperceptible detail. Near the base of the chair leg, where the wood had splintered slightly upon impact, there was a minute, crescent-shaped scratch on the polished oak. It wasn't a scratch from the chair. It was too clean, too curved. It looked like the mark of metal striking wood with force and then dragging away. Barlow leaned closer, his eye almost level with the floor. He scraped the tip of his knife along the line of the scratch, following its direction, a trajectory leading directly into the narrow space between the wainscoting and the floor. He knew the building was old. Things had a habit of falling into the crevices. He pried the wainscoting back gently. It gave with a small, brittle crack. He lifted the piece of wood. Lying in the dust, partially obscured by a century of detritus, was a thin, tarnished circlet of gold. Barlow reached in, his hand shaking, and picked it up. It was a simple wedding band. No inscription, but the weight and the design were unmistakable. It was the physical proof that corroborated Nora's unnerving insight. The killer, in the desperate act of removing the metal from Vance's death grip, had lost the one piece of evidence that tied him to his reputation, his family, his marriage, and his motive. The killer, obsessed with keeping his secret safe, had failed in the most basic human way. Barlow held the ring, the terror now replaced by a chilling certainty. He didn't need a forensic lab or a confession. He knew what he had to do. He had to confirm that this ring belonged to Reverend Elias Kincaid. He carefully wrapped the ring in a clean handkerchief and pocketed it. He had the motive, the ledgers, blackmail, the scapegoat, Silas, the location of the hidden evidence, the swamp, and now, the physical link to the killer, the ring, all woven together by the unsettling perception of a 6-year-old girl. Barlow rode back to the center of Black Creek, his focus now entirely on the Reverend's home. Elias Kincaid lived with his family in a comfortable 2-story house near the church, a symbol of his respected position. Barlow arrived at the parsonage. The Reverend's wife, a kindly, timid woman named Sarah, answered the door, her face a mask of strained civility. "Sheriff Barlow, what a surprise. Elias is in the study preparing his sermon for the midweek service." "I need a word with him, Sarah," Barlow said, keeping his voice neutral. "It's about the Vance case, a new development." Sarah stepped aside, allowing him entry. The house smelled of baking bread and sanctity, a stark contrast to the decay and fear that had become Barlow's constant companions. He found Reverend Kincaid in his study, a pipe in his hand, his eyes scanning a large leather-bound Bible. Kincaid was a man of medium height, impeccably dressed, with a stern, angular face. He looked up, his expression one of slight, weary annoyance. "Sheriff, to what do I owe this intrusion? I thought the Vance matter was at a standstill, save for poor Silas's regrettable actions." "It's not at a standstill, Reverend," Barlow said, closing the door firmly behind him. He didn't sit. He stood tall, dominating the small room. "It's reaching its conclusion." Kincaid placed his pipe in an ashtray, his movements slow and deliberate. "And what conclusion is that, Sheriff?" "The one that wasn't about a robbery," Barlow stated. "It was about secrets, Reverend. Secrets that Vance used to destroy people's lives and reputations." Barlow pulled out the handkerchief and unfolded it on the desk. The small gold band lay there, reflecting the light. Kincaid's face didn't betray a flicker of surprise, which in itself was terrifying. He simply stared at the ring, a cold, empty look in his eyes. "That's a simple wedding band, Sheriff," Kincaid said, his voice completely devoid of emotion. "They're common. What are you implying?" "I'm implying that one half of a couple lost this band at Vance's house the night he was murdered," Barlow said. "A moment of panic, a momentary loss of control. He let the silence hang, suffocating the room." Kincaid finally looked up at Barlow, and the mask of piety slipped away, revealing the stone-cold, desperate man beneath. His left hand, which had been resting on the arm of his chair, slowly moved to his right hand, and the movement was what broke Barlow's resolve. On Kincaid's right ring finger, a clear white mark, a distinct, untanned area of skin, was visible, where a ring had been worn for a very long time, and had only recently been removed. "Where is it, Elias?" Barlow asked, his voice shaking with a terrible mix of rage and disappointment. "Where did you put the gun?" Kincaid leaned back in his chair, a small, chilling smile spreading across his face. It was the smile of a man who knew he was caught, but who also knew he had orchestrated the perfect psychological cover-up. "The truth, Sheriff, is a matter of perspective," Kincaid said, his voice now a low, self-satisfied drone. "I didn't kill Elias Vance for money. I killed him for my faith. He was a cancer. I excised him, and as for the gun..." Kincaid reached into his vest pocket, and Barlow tensed, drawing his own gun. "Relax, Sheriff," Kincaid said, pulling out not a weapon, but a small, carefully folded piece of paper. "It's a confession, signed, dated, and witnessed. It details the debt, the blackmails, the fear, and it is signed by Silas Croft." Barlow stared at the document, the truth of the psychological terror hitting him with the force of a hammer. Kincaid had not only killed Vance and let Silas take the fall for the motive, but he had prepared a fake, documented confession, ensuring his own long-term safety. The Reverend had been 2 steps ahead of everyone. The physical evidence, the ring, was meaningless against the paper evidence of a confession that would be accepted by a fearful, reputation-obsessed community. The paper in Reverend Kincaid's hand was a masterpiece of cold, calculated malice. Barlow took the document, his fingers trembling not from fear, but from a profound moral outrage. It was written in a clear, flowing script, designed to mimic Silas Croft's own. It detailed a desperate confrontation over the usurious loan, a moment of passion, and the tragic, accidental pulling of the trigger. It was a story the town, already aware of Silas's debt and his temperament, would eagerly swallow. Silas signed this? Barlow's voice was barely a rasp. Of course not, Kincaid replied, his tone now one of supreme chilling rationality. I wrote it this morning. I am a man of the cloth, Sheriff. People trust my hand. And as I said, I signed it. I simply neglected to add the initial E on the last name. He gave a slight dismissive wave of his hand. Details. The point is, the community needs a resolution. They need the terror to end. They need a sinner to blame. Kincaid leaned forward, his composure absolute. You see, Sheriff, the ring is a truth known only to us. A tiny piece of metal found in the dust. The confession, however, is a narrative. It brings peace. It reinforces our faith. It allows the families of Black Creek, all those good people in my flock, including my wife and children, to maintain their dignity. You and I both know the alternative. The publication of the ledgers, the photographs, the ruin of half the town's respectable citizens. A minister caught gambling. A councilman taking bribes. The destruction of faith, the unraveling of everything we hold sacred. Barlow felt sick. Kincaid wasn't a desperate man. He was a self-appointed moral executioner, a man who saw his crime as a necessary act of societal maintenance. The psychological terror had escalated from a personal secret to a conspiracy of silence involving the entire community's reputation. You killed a man, Elias, Barlow stated, his eyes blazing. And you framed another. That is a sin of monumental proportion. A necessary sin, Tom. A sacrificial lamb to save the flock. Kincaid countered smoothly. If you reveal the truth, the full truth of the blackmail and the ring, you destroy Black Creek. Families will break, property will be lost, and the coal companies will use the chaos to buy up the land for pennies. You will be trading one dead man for the spiritual and possibly physical death of the entire holler. Barlow looked down at the gold ring in his hand, then at the forged confession. The dilemma was agonizing, a perfect psychological trap. If he chose justice, he chose social ruin. If he chose the community's survival, he chose injustice and the terrifying freedom of a sociopathic killer. Where is the gun, Elias? Barlow asked, needing one more piece of physical evidence to complete the picture. That, too, is dealt with, Kincaid said, finally allowing a hint of smugness to break his composure. It's with Silas. When I wrote the confession, I also penned a short anonymous note to your office, stating where a gun was hidden. The one Silas bought a month ago, the one I took from his barn this morning. A simple, convincing detail. The gun will be found in Silas's usual fishing spot, wrapped in an old cloth. You'll find the note when you return to your office. Kincaid had literally weaponized Silas's own possessions against him. The whole setup was flawlessly executed. The minister had used his position of trust and his meticulous mind to cover every possible angle, including planting physical evidence and manufacturing a written narrative. I am arresting you, Elias, Barlow said, pulling out the handcuffs. Kincaid sighed, a theatrical display of patience. I expected nothing less from a man of your integrity, Tom. But consider this. By arresting me and presenting the ring, you force the trial. At the trial, my defense will be simple. I will claim the ring is meaningless, and I will present the confession, which the jury will believe. Then, I will threaten to submit the ledgers and the photographs as proof of Vance's depravity and the community's motive to frame an innocent man, me. The entire town will turn against you, Sheriff. They will sacrifice you to keep their secrets buried. Barlow hesitated. The threat was terrifyingly real. A small-town jury, desperate to preserve their own reputations and the town's fragile peace, would certainly sacrifice a single, honest man. You're a coward and a monster, Barlow spat. I am a realist, Kincaid corrected. The moral choice here is not simple. It is a sacrifice of one man for the many. And in the end, you'll still have a killer walking free. Me. Barlow slowly placed the handcuffs on Kincaid's wrists. The click, a mournful sound. He had to trust in the remaining sliver of hope. The power of Nora's truth. The child had seen past the physical evidence into the psychological core of the crime. Perhaps she held the key to undermining Kincaid's narrative. He took Kincaid into the office, locking him in Silas's cell. Silas, seeing his former friend and spiritual leader behind bars, looked utterly bewildered. "Elias, what in the good Lord's name are you doing here?" Silas whispered. "I'm here to save your soul, Silas," Kincaid replied calmly, his voice ringing with false martyrdom. "The sheriff found a terrible piece of evidence, a confession signed by you. I am here to ensure that confession never sees the light of day. I will confess to a lesser crime, maybe even being an accomplice, to save you and the town's good name." Silas looked utterly distraught, torn between gratitude and confusion. Barlow found the anonymous note on his desk, exactly as Kincaid had promised. It detailed the location of the gun. He knew Kincaid was still in control, even from behind bars. Barlow knew he couldn't face the town alone. Kincaid had manipulated every adult in Black Creek. He only had one ally who saw the truth without the filter of reputation or self-preservation: Nora. He rode back to the ridge, the cold wind whipping at his face. He had to find a way to use Nora's uncanny insight, not as evidence, but as a lever. A way to turn the community's deep-seated suspicion against their trusted minister, forcing them to accept the uncomfortable truth over the comforting lie. Barlow found Nora exactly where he had left her, sitting quietly on the porch swing, seemingly untouched by the cataclysm he had just unleashed upon the town's most revered figure. Martha and Joseph were standing nervously in the doorway, their faces etched with anxiety after seeing the sheriff ride off with the Reverend. "Sheriff," Joseph began, his voice tight, "is this about the Vance case?" "Why Kincaid? He's the minister, a man of God." "He is the killer, Joseph," Barlow stated flatly, his exhaustion evident. "I have the motive, the location of the buried evidence, and a gold wedding band he lost at the scene. He's confessed, not to the murder, but to being an accomplice to Silas. He's trying to control the narrative." Martha wrung her hands. "But a minister? No one will believe it, Sheriff, especially against poor Silas's troubles." "That's exactly what he's banking on," Barlow admitted, running a hand through his hair. "He even forged a confession from Silas to ensure his story is airtight. He knows the town will choose the lie that preserves their reputation over the truth that destroys it." He looked at Nora, his last hope. "Nora, you saw the truth. You saw the feeling that connects the killer to the crime. I need to break Kincaid's lie, but the town won't listen to me. They only listen to the man of God." Nora's eyes, those clear, profound wells of observation, fixed on Barlow. "They do not listen to the man of God, Sheriff. They listen to the sermon. They listen to the words that make them feel safe, not the ones that make them feel true." Barlow felt a cold shiver. She was right. Kincaid's power lay in his rhetoric, his ability to craft a comforting narrative. "What is the key, Nora?" Barlow pleaded. "How do I make them see his truth instead of his lie?" Nora slowly stood up. "The killer is still wearing a mask, Sheriff. He is hiding his coldness behind the words of the Holy Book. When he preaches, he does not speak to God. He speaks to the things he hates." She walked to the edge of the porch, pointing toward the valley where the town lay. "The church. His words are there. His hate is there. He spoke the murder before he committed it. The people heard it, but they closed their ears because the words were wrapped in the skin of a prayer." Barlow's mind raced. Kincaid's sermons. Had he been setting the stage, preparing the community to accept a terrible truth or a terrible lie? Kincaid was meticulous. He would never leave a detail unmanaged. "The sermon," Barlow realized, snapping his fingers. "He's preparing for the midweek service. He'll use the service as his final statement, a declaration of Silas's guilt and his own martyrdom, ensuring the community's full support before the formal investigation even starts. Barlow immediately returned to his office. He had to get Kincaid to crack the facade of the pious martyr before he could deliver his final damning sermon. Barlow entered the cell block. Kincaid sat calmly on the cot, reading a small, leather-bound book. Silas was huddled in the corner, weeping softly. "The gun was where you said it would be, Elias," Barlow said, standing outside Kincaid's cell. "The setup is complete, but I'm going to break you before your midweek service." Kincaid looked up, his expression one of pity. "You can't, Tom. My spirit is pure in its purpose. You are trying to find an earthly flaw in a divine plan. The people will be at the service, and they will accept the truth I offer them." "Your truth is a lie," Barlow spat. "The ring in my pocket proves it. And Nora, the child who sees the truth, proves it." Kincaid finally reacted, a brief flash of pure hatred in his eyes at the mention of Nora's name. "That child is a disturbed little menace. She is a product of this sick, superstitious holler." He immediately recovered. "But even if she saw the ring, so what? You have a piece of jewelry and a child's fancy against a signed confession and a community's peace." "The sermon, Elias," Barlow challenged. "You prepared it this morning. You are going to use the pulpit to deliver your final lie. But I'm going to be there, and I'm going to stop you." "You can't stop the word of God, Sheriff," Kincaid said, with a triumphant smile. Barlow knew the only way to beat Kincaid was to use his own weapon, the narrative, against him. He left the cell and rode to the church. The midweek service was usually small, but the news of Kincaid's arrest had spread like wildfire. When Barlow entered, the small chapel was packed, the crowd buzzing with fear and morbid curiosity. Barlow walked directly to the pulpit. The church elder, an old man named Mr. Abernathy, immediately moved to block him. "Sheriff, you can't. The Reverend must speak." "The Reverend will not speak today," Barlow declared, his voice ringing through the silent church. "I have the real truth." The crowd erupted in murmurs and shouts. Barlow held up his hands, his face stern. "Elias Kincaid murdered Elias Vance, not for money, but to silence the secrets that would have destroyed his reputation and the reputations of many of you here." He laid the blackmail ledgers and the gold ring on the pulpit. The sight of the evidence, particularly the ledgers bearing the names of their neighbors, sent a palpable ripple of shock through the room. "This ring belongs to your minister," Barlow announced. "He lost it when he was taking this from Vance's dead hand." He held up the brass medal, but Abernathy spoke up, his voice firm. "The Reverend has confessed, Sheriff. He said Silas killed Vance and he only helped cover it up to save us from scandal. He is sacrificing himself." The crowd murmured in agreement. Kincaid's narrative was too powerful, too comforting. Barlow knew he had to play his last card. He needed to expose Kincaid's motive in a way that resonated emotionally with the fear in the room. "I have one last witness," Barlow announced. "A witness who doesn't see facts, but sees the psychological truth of the soul. Nora Vance." He nodded to the back of the church. Nora, accompanied by her parents, walked slowly down the aisle. Her solemn presence, her small figure in the grand, intimidating space, silenced the crowd entirely. Barlow addressed the child. "Nora, you said the murderer felt cold, like a stone that hides the fire. And you said he spoke the murder before he committed it. Tell the people of Black Creek what you heard in the Reverend's words." Nora stood by the pulpit, looking out at the anxious, frightened faces. She pointed to a passage in the open Bible on the stand, the very page Kincaid had been studying. He was practicing his speech. Nora's small voice resonated clearly. He looked at this part, the part about excision and sacrifice. But his eyes were not reading the holy words. His eyes were looking at the names he wanted to cut out of the book. He said, "I will not let the canker destroy my home." And he was smiling, not with his mouth, but with his cold eyes. He was happy to hurt the canker. Vance was not the canker. The secrets were the canker. And the secrets belong to all of you." The silence was profound. The crowd was staring at the Bible, then at each other, then at the ledgers and the gold ring. They had heard Kincaid use that exact terminology, canker, excision, in his sermons before. It was his unique vocabulary of moral condemnation. The minister's cold, superior rationality, the very thing that made him meticulous, was his undoing. He had to be right, even in his murderous rhetoric. Then Nora looked directly at Mr. Abernathy, the town elder. "Mr. Abernathy, you owe him $300, and he took a photograph of you 2 years ago at the saloon. You believe the lie because his truth will hurt your wife." The elder staggered back, his face pale with shock. The public exposure, delivered by a child, was more devastating than any courtroom evidence. The community's foundation of secrecy shattered. Barlow realized the core of the psychological terror was broken. The truth was no longer a personal threat, but a collective one, exposed by an innocent witness. Kincaid had failed because he couldn't control the raw, unfiltered honesty of a child. The collective gasp that filled the church after Nora's quiet, devastating revelation was the sound of an entire community's carefully constructed facade collapsing. Mr. Abernathy stumbled away from the pulpit, his face a roadmap of guilt and terror, his public shame ensuring that Kincaid's fabricated narrative would no longer hold sway. Nora, without a single piece of tangible evidence, had used the shared knowledge of Kincaid's cold, judgmental rhetoric and the hidden personal shame of the town to break the psychological grip of his lies. Barlow stood before the now shattered congregation, the gold ring and the ledgers serving as silent, irrefutable witnesses. The truth was out. Elias Vance, the victim, was an insidious blackmailer, and Reverend Kincaid, the spiritual leader, was a calculated killer. The community was riddled with the very sins their minister had so fiercely condemned. The ensuing chaos was immediate. People began to point fingers at each other, their reputations now vulnerable. Barlow raised his voice, a desperate attempt to regain control. "Reverend Kincaid is under arrest for the murder of Elias Vance. He acted alone, driven by his own secrets. His confession on behalf of Silas Croft is a complete fabrication." He commanded the stunned congregants to go home and deal with their consciences, confirming the social contract of Black Creek was irrevocably broken. Barlow returned to his office, where Kincaid's composure was finally beginning to crack. "That child!" Kincaid hissed through the bars, his pious mask replaced by maniacal fury. "She is an unnatural creature. Her words are not evidence. Her words are the truth, Elias," Barlow said quietly. "The emotional and psychological truth that your meticulously planned lies failed to account for. You forgot about the most powerful evidence of all, the moral certainty of a child who sees past the surface." Barlow then released Silas Croft. "Silas, you are no longer a suspect for murder. Kincaid is the killer." Silas stared at Kincaid, twisting with betrayal and relief. "Elias, you would have let me hang?" Kincaid merely turned his back. "I was saving the town, Silas." "Your sacrifice would have been for the greater good." "There is no greater good in a lie, Elias," Barlow stated. "You will be transferred to the county jail tomorrow." Barlow looked at Silas grimly. "The ledgers prove your debt, Silas, and you still broke the law. You will stand trial for obstruction." The terrifying reality was that even the innocent paid a price for the web of lies. Barlow knew the next few days would be brutal, his own reputation subject to intense scrutiny. He had arrested the most respected man and implicated nearly half the town. He rode back to Nora's cabin late that afternoon. He found her on the porch swing. "It's over, Nora. Kincaid is caught. You solved a murder that no one else could touch." Nora looked up at him. "It was never about the murder, Sheriff. It was about the coldness. The man who kills to save his own stone heart is the greatest terror." "And the sad, broken thing?" Barlow asked, needing final clarity. "The sad, broken thing was the truth, Sheriff. Hidden in the swamp, hidden in the floor, hidden in the sermon. It was only broken because no one would look for it. Barlow understood. Nora had seen the sickness of the community. Her heightened sensitivity was not fantastical, but an acute perception of human fear, shame, and malice. The real horror of Black Creek was its own internal corruption, exposed by a child who hadn't learned to lie. Barlow left the holler, weary, but certain of the truth. The memory of the town's shame, the psychological scar, would forever remain, an echo in the hills. The following days brought the reckoning to Black Creek. The state police arrived, dealing not with a simple homicide, but with a systemic collapse of civil order. Barlow handed over the evidence, the blackmail ledgers, the photographs, the gold wedding band, and Kincaid, who maintained his self-pitying silence. The town, now a psychological battleground, fractured. Neighbors, their secrets exposed, turned hostile. The terror was no longer of a killer, but of the man who knew their secret. Barlow found himself isolated, hailed by the state, but reviled locally. The people he saved saw him as the destroyer of their reputations, the man who chose the brutal truth over the comfortable lie. A small delegation of the town's former leaders, including the now shamed Mr. Abernathy, confronted Barlow outside his office. "Show some restraint, Sheriff," Abernathy pleaded. "If you give them everything, this town will be ruined. We will lose our livelihoods. You lost those things when you allowed Vance to control you and Kincaid to dictate your moral compass," Barlow countered, his voice steady. "I have no right to withhold evidence of criminal enterprise. The truth is the only way this town can ever rebuild." "The truth is too expensive," a councilman sneered. Kincaid understood the need for a comfortable darkness. Barlow stood firm. "The evidence goes to the state. You will all face the consequences of your choices." Their parting was silent. Barlow was now truly alone, his integrity his only companion. Silas Croft, released on bail, returned to a cold reception. The shame of his debt and his near involvement weighed heavily. His trial for obstruction was set, a painful reminder of his panicked failure. Barlow supervised the dismantling of the Vance estate, struck by the irony. Vance, the meticulous recorder of sins, was undone by a forgotten military medal and a lost wedding band. His tools of destruction were human frailty. Barlow rode up to see Nora one final time before transferring Kincaid. "I'm leaving the holler for a few days, Nora," he informed her. Nora nodded, her gaze fixed on the dense woods. "The darkness is moving, Sheriff. It is moving from the center of the town and going back to the hills. The darkness is Kincaid's legacy," Barlow said. "No," Nora corrected. "The darkness is the fear that allowed him to speak. That fear is still here. The man is gone, but the shadows he used are still long." Barlow understood that the ultimate psychological terror was the collective capacity for self-deception. He left the holler with gratitude for Nora's honesty. The silence of the holler was one of wary, suspicious observation. The mystery was solved, but the suspense of who would be exposed next hung over Black Creek like a perpetual, suffocating fog. The trial of Reverend Elias Kincaid dominated the county press. The combination of the respected minister, the ruthless blackmailer, and the testimony of the 6-year-old girl made sensational headlines. Kincaid was convicted of murder in the first degree. Barlow's testimony was the linchpin, confirming Nora's accuracy in predicting the evidence location and sensing the killer's psychological slip-up. He framed Nora's sight as an extraordinary capacity for observation, untainted by the fear and self-preservation that blinded the adults. Silas Croft received a lenient sentence for obstruction, acknowledging the duress he was under. He and Mary quietly moved out of Black Creek. As for Black Creek, the scandal brought an end to its isolation. The coal company used the chaos to acquire land from families ruined by the loans and legal fallout. The town's leadership was decimated. A few families remained, forced to build a new life based on suspicion rather than trust. Sheriff Tom Barlow stayed on, a lonely, weary figure of authority. He had his integrity, but he had lost his community. He learned that the most dangerous criminals are those who successfully mask their malice with respectability. Years passed. The story of Nora became a chilling morality tale. Nora, now a young woman, never lost her profound clarity. She became a teacher in the remaining cabins, her intelligence sharp. She taught the children to observe, to see the difference between the word and the intent, the action and the motive. One cold, misty October evening, nearly 2 decades later, Barlow, now aging, visited Nora at her small schoolhouse. He presented her with a small wooden box. Inside was Elias Vance's brass military medal. "It belongs with the person who truly understood its meaning," Barlow explained. Nora picked up the heavy medal. "The sad, broken thing," she murmured, a faint adult smile touching her lips. "It was broken not because Vance died, Sheriff. It was broken because a man who swore to protect his country turned it into a weapon to destroy his neighbor. And the man who preached faith used his own marriage as a tool to commit murder." She placed the medal back in the box and looked at Barlow. "The greatest truth, Sheriff, is that the darkness is never external. It is always the simple, desperate choices of men who want to protect their secrets. That is the only horror that is real, and the only mystery worth solving." Barlow nodded, feeling a profound sense of resolution. The mystery of the murder was solved by understanding how human fear and hypocrisy could create a web of terror. He left the schoolhouse, the old holler quiet once more. The memory of the town's shame, the psychological scar, would forever remain, an echo in the hills of West Virginia.